live stream?
Yeah, I have started it.
Okay, fabulous. Good evening, everybody, and happy Hanukkah, and welcome to the Quarantine-ish Book Talks. I'm Judith Rosenbaum of the Jewish Women's Archive. I'm so excited to be here with you tonight and to be with our author, Janice Kaplan. I want to thank the National Endowment for the Humanities for supporting our online programming, and I want to thank jewishLIVE for being a great partner through all of these events. For those of you who are new to JWA, we are a digital archive that helps expand the Jewish narrative by documenting and sharing Jewish women's stories. JWA explores the past as a framework for understanding the world today, and there's a lot for us to understand and explore and to think about how we make it different. The Quarantine-ish Book Talks are just one very small aspect of JWA's work. It's been an important aspect for us for these many months of the pandemic, but I hope that you will also check out jwa.org to explore the projects and resources that we have to offer there. We have so many rich materials to explore. A quick moment of logistics. Please introduce yourself in the chat box, put your questions in the chat box. Make sure to chat to panelists and attendees so that everybody can see your introductions and your comments and your questions, and I will be sure to bring questions into our conversation. So I am really delighted to introduce Janice Kaplan, who is a journalist, a TV producer, and the author of 15 popular books, including the New York Times bestseller, The Gratitude Diaries, and her newest book, which we'll be talking about tonight, The Genius of Women. Janice was the editor-in-chief of Parade magazine and the executive producer of the TV Guide television group, where she created and produced more than 30 primetime network television specials. She's written for dozens of national magazines and websites and appears frequently on TV shows, including Today and Good Morning America. And she now hosts the daily podcast, The Gratitude Diaries, on iHeartMedia. So check that out. Janice graduated magna cum laude from Yale University, which is actually my alma mater, where she won Yale's Murray Fellowship for her writing. Welcome, Janice. So glad to have you
Thanks,
here.
Judith. We'll have to talk Yale later.
Yes. So tell us a little bit about how you came to this project. Why a book on genius?
Sure. Well, I've spent much of my career very interested in women's issues, and I think we all know the obstacles that women face. That's not such a big surprise to any of us. But as I was thinking about women over the years, I was always startled by how it is that there are always women in every generation that, despite all the obstacles in their way, manage to soar so high and achieve so much. And I really wondered, how could that be? Who are they? What have they done? And the very specific impetus for this book and for the idea of genius came after a friend of mine named Mike Berland, who's a pretty well-known pollster and strategist, did a survey. It was actually a few years ago for the 92nd Street Y in New York City. And part of it was on genius. And one of his questions was about male and female genius. And in that, he found that 90% of Americans said that geniuses tend to be men. We just had an election, that 90% of Americans do not agree on anything. And when asked to name a female genius, virtually the only person anyone could come up with was Marie Curie. So Mike and I actually had lunch one day and he presented these findings to me and he said, "What do you think is going on?" And I really didn't have an answer for him, but I spent the next 2 years trying to come up with one.
This resonates with me so deeply because it's so much, so deeply rooted in the kind of work that we do at JWA, and we talk about these kinds of issues all the time. And in fact, I used to go around and talk to people, to students and other groups about, being able to name not even geniuses, just Jewish women who had made a difference. And usually they could come up with one or two. And interestingly, who that person was changed over time. Mm-hmm. In recent years, it was RBG. But before that, sometimes it was Golda Meir. Now, no kids know who Golda Meir is. But it's a really interesting question when you see that kind of just like absolute blank and people can't draw because it's not the image that they have, right? They have to really, it's like they look at the genius box or whatever, and that looks like a man. And so they're trying to figure out what fits in that box. So how did you think even about how to define a genius and what, because obviously like the way people are defining it is limiting the set from which they're pulling. So how did you think about how to define it for the book?
Well, I actually define genius very broadly, and I ultimately defined it as just people who are doing smart and interesting work. And most of the definitions we have of genius, including IQ, are just meaningless. And I very quickly discovered that, a long time ago, there've been over the years all sorts of crazy ways that people have defined genius, including the circumference of your head and the thought that the bigger your head was, the more intelligent you were. And that turns out to be about as valid as IQ is. But I think the best definition of genius came to me early on in my research. I was in London and I met a professor at Cambridge University named Charles Jones. And Charles and I also went out to lunch. You get good writers, good lunches when you're a writer. And I told him that I was working on genius. And in his very plumy English accent, which I won't try to imitate, he said, genius, that would be where extraordinary talent meets celebrity. And I was really taken aback by that. Extraordinary talent meets celebrity. This is a very classic Cambridge University academic. He did not mean that in a Tom Hanks Hollywood sort of way. And I realized, though, that what he did mean is that celebrity in the sense of getting your work noticed, being recognized. And throughout history, Judith, as you well know, and probably right up until this very moment, women have had one half of that equation. They've had the extraordinary talent, they've had the great ability, but they've not had the notice. They've not had the celebrity, the recognition. And so they've not been seen as geniuses. And when you're not considered a genius, it's much harder for your work to have an impact and for your work to have an impact on future generations too.
Right. I mean, we talk about this with history. One of our favorite quotes is from the woman who created the earliest publication for American Jewish women, which was called the American Jewess, which was published in the late 19th century. Her name was Rosa Sonnenschein. And she said in her inaugural issue, she said, not what happens, but what is recorded makes history. So it's that recording piece. It's the recognition and the recording. Because you talk in your book about some people who were noted in their time, but then were kind of totally lost to history because people just didn't really take them that, historians didn't write about them because they were just women, or because the place where they showed their talent was not a place where we usually look for genius.
That's exactly right. And it happens quite as innocently as you've just described it. And it also happens with perhaps a bit more, I won't say malevolence, but with a bit more realization of what's going on. I saw over and over again cases where women were just deliberately written out of history because men didn't want to think of them as being as important as they were and didn't want to pay attention to them, or deliberately overlooked them because it wasn't, as you said, the way we think about women. So yeah, that has been a persistent and pretty devastating problem.
And one of the things that you talk about also is that genius is something that needs to be nurtured. It needs to be recognized, but it also needs to be nurtured. So that, if women are, bringing their raw talent to a social context where there is no support for them, then there is no way for them to take it to that next level where they would be able to be at that kind of level of, of accomplishment.
We tend to think, you're absolutely right, and we tend to think of genius as an absolute, as black and white, as either you are or you aren't. And that's simply not the case. As you said, genius needs to be nurtured, a genius needs to be recognized, and genius needs to be nurtured. And those are two really key things. I think one of the realizations that I came to as I was writing the book is that the truly, truly extraordinary women, that one in a million who are just going to stand out and overcome obstacles and not see anything in their way, they're going to make it. They're going to find a way. They're going to work around anything that's in their way. The much greater problem is perhaps on that next level, the 3 in a million, the 100 in a million, the people who are extraordinarily talented, but who do need a bit more of that nurturing and a bit more of that attention. And those are the ones, those are the women who get abandoned and who get lost and who we need to pay attention to now more than ever.
Right. So Karen asked an interesting question about whether you think people who are geniuses always want to be recognized. If recognition is an important part of being labeled a genius, what if you don't, what if you're not seeking that kind of attention?
Well, then I think it's a problem. And let me give you an example. I think it's one of the things that women often do, which is that we are self-deprecating. And I think one of the things smart women and talented women learn is not to be threatening and not to let other people know how good you are and not to let other people know how smart you are. And I think that's a real problem. And it's certainly, if I personally learned anything in writing this book, it was to stop being so self-deprecating. Let me give you an example of something that a professor named Meg Urey, who is at Yale, told me. She was the head of the physics department at Yale, the first tenured woman physics professor at Yale. By the way, this is 2020. It's amazing the number of women I interviewed who it was the first of something. And Meg had been at NASA before Yale hired her away. And she's very aware of issues facing women. And a few years ago, some years ago now, she was having a meeting of women tenured faculty at Yale. And it was for a different subject. It was actually to teach them how to write op-eds and get themselves noticed as more. But anyway, she started this meeting by asking them to each go around the room and say what they were an expert in, basically to just introduce themselves. So the first woman said, hello, my name is Susan, and well, I would say I'm an expert, but I'm really good in. And then the next woman said, hi, I'm Sally, and of course, I'm also not an expert, but my field is. And they went around the room, each woman putting herself down that way, and Meg said she was infuriated. First of all, being a tenured professor at Yale is by definition an expert. And the currency at a university is expertise. And yet these women had been so, in some ways, beaten down that they felt that they shouldn't announce themselves as being as talented as they are. And Meg said that she would see that over and over again, even in her position as the chairman of the department, that men who were maybe not the best professors or associate professors would come in and explain to her why they deserved raises and to be made full professors. And women who were extremely talented would never think of doing that. So I think the question about recognition is, we better recognize ourselves because nobody else is going to do it for us. And, Sheryl Sandberg made the point in Lean In about don't drop out before you're required to. Well, don't put yourself down. There are plenty of other people who are willing to do that for you.
Right. And it was interesting because in parts of the, I think that issue touches on maybe a transition point that women are at, right? Where for a long time, it was actually a strategy, a survival strategy for women to be kind of self-deprecating. It was a way to avoid, sometimes life-threatening situations. It was a way to flatter men who then might look upon your ideas more, kindly if they felt like you weren't so threatening. And then at a certain point, it doesn't serve you anymore, right? You get to a certain point where that kind of behavior actually holds you back. So a lot of the things that women have learned as, kind of strategic ways to manage the world, which, as you say in your book, some of that is actually a kind of genius. The ways that women have learned how to work the system, a system that really does not serve them very well, those are certain skills that women have really developed. And yet they don't help you when you get to the genius realm. And I thought that, this was one of the things that I really loved about your book, is that you address both the structural issues that hold women back from being geniuses, or being considered in that category. And you also explore the kind of internalized ways that women find it hard to play in that space sometimes.
Right. And I think your description of the great workaround is what women have done and have done throughout history. You mentioned Ruth Bader Ginsburg before. When Ruth Bader Ginsburg was applying to Harvard, the dean of Harvard asked her why she should be admitted and take the place of a man. Now, the obvious answer would have been, I am smarter than any man, but that probably wouldn't have gotten her into Harvard. And instead, she said, well, I would like to learn the law so that I could be a better wife to my husband, Marty. Now, she might have felt slightly nauseous when she said that, I don't know, but she did get into Harvard, and she continued doing that kind of workaround when she was bringing the early gender inequality cases. She often had plaintiffs who were men to try to show that gender inequality hurts men and women together. And I saw this over and over again. There's a story in the book about Fanny Mendelssohn, way back in the 1700s, the sister of Felix Mendelssohn, an extraordinarily talented woman who wasn't allowed to publish under her own name because she was a woman and it was going to be considered a great scandal. So she wrote 400 songs that she published under Felix's name. Now, Felix always said that he was protecting her from scandal and he was doing her a great favor. I say
So
beware of
selfless
men
of
who
him.
say they're protecting you. My favorite story there was that he once got invited to Buckingham Palace and Queen Victoria said she had invited him because he had written one of her very favorite songs. And what could the man say? He knew Fanny had written it. But for Fanny, that also was a way of doing a workaround at the time. You talked about, does change happen and do you get to a point? Well, it's not just generationally, it's within each woman. At some point, and sadly late in her life was when she was in her late 30s, Fanny Mendelssohn decided, I don't care what society says, I want to publish under my own name. And she did publish some songs under her own name, and she said it was the happiest time of her life. And tragically, she died shortly afterwards. But so I think is that great message of that you're saying, sometimes you have to do that workaround, not to be, to fit into society, to recognize how society is standing in your way. And sometimes you have to say, you know what, I'm just going to stand up and be who I want to be and do what I want.
Right. And Fanny Mendelssohn also kind of had a workaround by when she was told she couldn't perform publicly. She said, great, I'll hold a salon, which, and I'll host people in my home. And that's something that I'm allowed to do as a woman. And then she would give concerts basically in her home to many, many people. So it wasn't public because it was in the domestic space, but it was a way for her to perform in front of an audience under terms that were, more acceptable at the time. So that also to me seemed like a very creative approach to the problem.
Exactly right. She was about 14 years old when she had been touring with Felix. They were both playing. If anything, Fanny was a better musician than he was. And she was about 14 years old when her father, Abraham Mendelssohn, sent her a letter telling her that it was time for her to go home and learn needlework and get married. And he said that for Felix, music could always be his career, but for her, it could only be an ornament, never the heart of her being. And that's so tragic, because it was the heart of her being, but she did exactly what you said. She went home and she figured out how to keep playing by doing those great salons in her own home in Berlin.
Right. Yeah. No, I mean, it is heartbreaking to hear about some of the ways in which these things get defined. But one of the other things that I thought was interesting was that you noted that for a lot of the women that were successful, who you featured in your book, that it's not that they didn't notice the structural inequality, or maybe some of them didn't, but it's hard to imagine they didn't notice it, but they didn't, they kind of chose not to look at it. They chose to continue pursuing their passion and their path without, in some ways, without getting angry about it. They just kind of put that aside and moved forward. And it's one of the things that you notice many of them had in common, and seems to be a kind of a common trait of women geniuses, is the ability to have that, I think you call it sort of blinders about bias.
Absolutely. I saw that over and over again, that blinders to bias, that not recognizing the obstacles. Meg Urey, who I mentioned before from Yale, said that when she was young, she wanted to be a NASA scientist. And now there actually were some women NASA scientists, as we now know, Katherine Johnson from Hidden Figures and some of the others, but no women were obvious. Nobody saw any women at NASA, and certainly not in the kind of scientific role that Meg thought she wanted. And she said that when she was young and she knew she wanted to go to NASA and she didn't see any other women there, she thought, oh, I know, it must just be that no other women wanted to go there. And so with that absolute certainty of, oh, nobody else ever thought of this before me, she just went ahead and did it, and did get that important role at NASA. And she said, of course, in looking back, she realizes that was baloney. Of course, there were a lot of women who wanted to do that over the years, but they just never had the courage to. But I think that sense of not seeing the obstacles and of telling yourself there's nothing that's going to be in my way actually does serve women very well. the other side of that is that once you get in a position where you can do something, where you can create change, it's vitally important that you do. And somebody like Meg Urey and her colleague at Princeton, Joe Dunkley, who also, like Meg, just, never saw any problem about being the only woman in her physics class, and never saw the problem to raise her hand in her physics class because she didn't really notice that there weren't any other women there. But both of them, when they got to positions where they could do something, where they could help other women, they took off those blinders really quickly, and then wanted to make things easier for the women who followed them. But I think as a general rule, yeah, there are big social issues that we all face, but we and our children and our grandchildren only have one life. And I think it's not a bad idea to tell them, just keep plowing forward.
Right. Yeah. But it is frustrating. I mean, sometimes I think it's personality. Like, I don't know that I could not be angry about certain things. I guess I won't be a genius, but it's also frustrating when you see, I mean, we see a lot of women who have succeeded now who don't get to that second stage where once they have the power to make change, choosing to make change, where they get into positions of power and say, well, I got here, so obviously there's no problem, right? Which seems like a failure of some kind. So I loved that there was that kind of second, that you identified that second phase of, like, once you are in a position, when you're not in a position of power, it's best to not focus on your powerlessness and just keep going. But once you get to that position of power, there is a recognition that, well, now I have a responsibility to do something, and I can actually speak up about this thing that I couldn't speak up about before. Exactly.
Yeah. I mentioned Joe Dunkley, and she certainly, I fell into a bit of what you're suggesting when I was first interviewing her, because she's a young woman, she's barely 40, and she's a tenured professor at Princeton. She had been a tenured professor at Oxford. She has 2 little children. She's made these great discoveries and won all sorts of awards. And I said to her exactly what you're just saying now. I said, well, Joe, if you did it, doesn't it mean that other women should be able to do it too? And she looked at me and she said, no, absolutely not. You shouldn't have to have my personality to be a great scientist. And that's a really good point, because we ask women to be 2 things. We ask them to be geniuses and great at their work and great at what they do. And we also ask them to stand up to the whole world and to fight off the whole world and to figure out for themselves little things like, how do I balance family and work? Because certainly nobody is helping them figure that out. So yes, we ask a lot of these women. Look, not all women are the same. Some are going to get to that position where they do say, you shouldn't need my personality. And some will say, I did it, you should be able to also. And right. I think we can't make huge generalizations about women or men.
Right. Well, and there was a piece that you quoted from Meg Urey also, where she just had very sharp language around, she was talking about colleagues who say, well, I don't want special treatment as a woman. And she just sort of says, like, there already is special treatment. You're getting special treatment. It's just bad special treatment. And men are getting special treatment too, but no one's giving language to that. So to be actually, it's part of what is just so powerful, I think, is even just when people are able to, speak the reality in a plain way that can really transform the way we see things, because we don't think about things in those terms. And then just all it takes sometimes is one person to frame it in a different way. And it kind of is like, oh, of course, right. That makes sense. And it can really, I think, shift the way people understand these issues. So it was very exciting to see the ways in which many of the women that you described not only have achieved, incredible accomplishment in their field, but also have are just very perceptive about what it takes and are able to kind of put that language out there. I think that's part of what makes it possible for other people to follow them.
Right. And I think sometimes just having the conversations, just making people aware, we don't need quotas, we don't need specific rules always, but just as you're saying, making people aware, letting them change their perspective, shift what they're thinking. The Nobel Committee a few years ago, or just a couple of years ago, actually, when it started sending out its requests for nominations, which it does to various professors and academics, it started adding a note saying, please think widely and in diverse ways as you're making your nominations. It didn't say anything, and that's not the exact language, but it's roughly, and it didn't say anything more dramatic than that. It didn't say, please have half the nominees women. It just asked people to think more diversely, and just reminding people to do that changed hugely the percentage of women and other minorities who were being nominated. And I think that's very telling, that we don't need to put up restrictions and quotas. We just need to say to people, take a look, remember who's there, and open your eyes a little bit.
Right. And to get back to that idea about the people who are able to pursue things that they've never seen before. I mean, one of the things we say at JWA all the time is that if you can see it, you can be it, meaning that, representation matters. What we see as role models shapes what we imagine is possible. And in fact, in your book, Mayim Bialik says a similar kind of thing about the importance of representation. But I puzzle over this a lot, because that's obviously true in many ways, and representation does matter, and role models, having an expansive array of role models is really important. And yet there are people for whom that is not true, who can imagine themselves into situations that have never been seen before. And I've always been curious about that, actually. My mom was a professor, and I remember her telling me that she never had a female professor in all of her years of school. I mean, she had teachers who were female in elementary school, but she did not have, in all of her years of college and graduate school, she did not have a female professor. And I remember saying to her, like, well, then how did you know you could be one? And she didn't really have an answer to that. And I think it is a kind of interesting question around what makes it possible for some people to be able to, kind of have that kind of vision. I mean, thank God that there are people who are not, who are more imaginative or free in that way. But I think it's an interesting question, and I think part of the question for me is sort of like, what do we learn from them, and how do we harness that? Did you get any any sense of that from meeting some of these people?
Yeah, I describe it in the book by calling it people who see the world as, what do I say? I think I called it men, women, and me. And that they're people who don't see, they're not thinking of themselves as, oh, I'm like a man, so I can do that. But they look at the roles that women have and they say, but that's not really what I'm trying to do. And they just say, well, I guess I'm a little different, and this is who I am, and I'm just going to go ahead and do that. And I agree, that's really hard to do. And there are very exceptional people who do that. I think most people do indeed need a role model. But who are those role models? They are the people who manage to just break out and do something regardless of what was expected of them, and to look beyond the social expectations and the social boundaries. One of the women I met who was a great example of that was Frances Arnold, who is a professor in I think she's at UC Berkeley, at Caltech, who won the Nobel Prize in chemistry a couple of years ago. And, it takes decades. She's probably in her late 50s, early 60s now. And it takes decades, of course, to win a Nobel Prize. So when she started this research, which was on a new way to create proteins and enzymes in a lab that was going to completely upend chemistry, she was quite young. And other chemists and other professors told her, this is not going to work. You can't do this. You can't turn things upside down that way. It's not going to work. And I said to her, how did you have the courage as a young woman scientist to go ahead and do that? And she said, I did not doubt myself. And I thought, where does that come from? How are you able to say, I did not doubt myself? And could you imagine what all of us could do if we were able to needlepoint that on our pillows and have, I did not doubt myself, be part of our repertoire? And, you don't necessarily need Frances Arnold's great personality to do that. Another young woman who I interviewed named Fei Li is at Stanford, and she is a genius in artificial intelligence, one of the great experts in the field, and she created a new way for computers to see. And it's a technique that's now being used for everything. It's being used for driverless cars and all over. And once again, when she started out doing that, and she's much younger, she's in her 40s, people were telling her it wasn't going to work. And once again, she was trying something crazy and different. And I asked her the same question, and she said, well, I thought, what's the problem? I thought about what they said and I didn't agree with them. And I thought, well, I'll go ahead and try. And if it doesn't work, I'll try something else. And that core of confidence, that core of belief in yourself, that unwillingness to be pushed around by the world is hard fought and hard to come by. But when you do get it, when you can instill it in somebody, it makes an enormous difference.
Yeah, I wish we could bottle that. I have a 14-year-old daughter, and I would really like to be able to give her that inoculation against self-doubt. One of the characters that I thought of, one of the historical figures that I thought of as I was reading your book, who I think in some ways it's a little bit of a different model than the one you're talking about in terms of, it's an example of persistence. I think maybe more based on the idea of a calling. And Zelda mentioned her in the chat, is Rabbi Regina Jonas, who was the first woman to be ordained as a rabbi, at least that we know of in the modern world. And she was ordained in 1935 in Berlin. And she just knew from when she was a young girl, even though there was no model for a woman in that clergy role, she knew that that's what she wanted to be. And despite the fact that everyone around her said, well, that's just not possible, she just kept sort of doggedly pursuing it. And she, you know, she began studying in a Jewish studies program, even though at first they said, well, you're not going to be able to be ordained. And then there was someone who's going to ordain her, and then he died before she finished, and no one else would ordain her. And she just kept moving forward. And ultimately she was ordained. And then, in fact, she was able to work for unfortunate reasons, which is that the men in Berlin were being deported and leaving. And so they needed more religious leaders. And so she was there, and she stepped forward and served as a rabbi for a few years in Berlin, and then in Theresienstadt, where she was deported, and then she was murdered in Auschwitz. And interestingly about her story, she had the foresight to put some of her papers in an archive in Berlin before she left, but they were behind the Berlin Wall. They were behind the Iron Curtain and were sort of forgotten about, or not rediscovered until 91. But there were other survivors who knew her from Berlin, knew her from the camps, knew exactly who she was and what she had done. She didn't make any bones about it. She very proudly gave sermons she wrote them down and put them in the archives as sermons delivered by Rabbi Regina Jonas. And those people who survived and who continued on, just as we were talking about before, just chose not to tell her story for whatever reasons. There are many things we could come up with to explain that. And then she was rediscovered in the 90s, and it was kind of a revelation to a lot of rabbis who had been ordained in, the 70s and 80s, thinking that they were the first, that Sally Priesand was the first in 1972, and not knowing that, sort of was reshaped their whole consciousness of what it was to be a woman in the rabbinate, knowing that there had been one in 1935 who had then been forgotten. So, that kind of the idea of someone being the one person who believes that this is possible and having that persistence to just keep showing up and keep asking and not be discouraged when people say that's ridiculous and offensive and not possible, and you're making a mockery, and they just keep going. It's hard to wrap one's mind around, and also so inspiring.
It's a great story, and I certainly didn't know that one, so thank you. I would love to be able to add that to the next edition. I think part of it, and what you're describing with the rabbi and perhaps with others of those earlier times, is what I've sort of described as an ability to see beyond gender. She obviously never saw herself as a woman and a woman rabbi. It was, yes, she's a woman, that's great, and yes, she's going to be a rabbi, and they're unrelated. And I heard that kind of story from many, many women. And I think we make such a mistake when we put people into buckets. And I've heard from many women rabbis as I've been talking about the book, and I talk about how we do tend to talk about people as women scientists, women doctors, women lawyers. And I would hear over and over again people saying, yes, nobody has ever referred to me as the rabbi. I'm always the woman rabbi. And why do we do that? All women rabbis are not the same. All women doctors are not the same. And
right, so and we wouldn't describe, you wouldn't describe, this is my man rabbi.
Right, exactly. And as soon as you use that, as soon as you're saying a woman or female, you're immediately saying that this is an aberration. This is somebody different. And rabbis are men. And so this is the woman rabbi. And I think, yeah, I think that kind of language is very telling and sends the message that this is somebody different. But people like that first rabbi who you described, didn't see themselves that way. They weren't looking at themselves or herself as, I'm a woman, can I do this? She was looking at herself in well beyond that. And I think, again, I'm not completely sure where that comes from, but it's certainly something that a lot of women do feel.
You know, one of the things I couldn't help but notice, of course, in your book is that many of the women that you talk about were Jewish. And I think that the Jewish community does have a certain interest in genius, and there's certainly a lot of talk about sort of Jewish pride, about, you know, I hear this all the time, and, you know, sort of how many Jews have won the Nobel Prize, and, you know, it is definitely something that Jews often pay attention to or prize in a certain way. So was there anything as you were doing this work that you, or, you know, as you've been thinking about genius, are there any particular kind of Jewish angles that you found about it? Like, is there anything Jewish about genius? Or I guess that's a sort of tongue-in-cheek question, but, you know, how does Jewishness, do you think, interact with some of the dynamics that you're discussing around some of these women? I mean, there are so many in the book, Lise Meitner, Rosalind Franklin, we talked about Fanny Mendelssohn, RBG, of course, and Wojcicki, I never know if that's the right way to pronounce her name.
Mm-hmm.
But there are so many who kind of pass through your chapters. And of course, I, as someone wearing JWA glasses, noticed them. But was curious whether, you know, you've thought about that piece of it at all.
When I was writing the book, I was not aware of it. And only after the book came out did many people point out to me how many of the women were indeed from Jewish backgrounds. And I say Jewish backgrounds because I think that's important. They were not religious Jews. I don't think any of the women were religious Jews, and many of them were, in fact, very secular. But I do think that the Jewish emphasis on education and on the importance of learning and on the value that we put on schooling is really key, and has had a very deep influence. One of the things that I certainly learned was the messages that get sent to little kids. And I talk about it in the book in terms of the messages that we send to girls and boys about what they should be doing, and how sometimes those are subtle and sometimes not so subtle, even when we think we're raising our children without those biases. But I think in Jewish homes, the message gets sent also, and gets sent to the children that education is important and that learning is important. And certainly in the family where I grew up, my parents did have a big distinction between my brother and the two sisters, and they certainly had a different feeling about that. But education was key for all of us, and being smart was a really good thing. And I think that's I think it's a Jewish cultural issue that certainly does imbue many families and many homes, and may indeed lead to the surprising number of people who are number of Jews who are overrepresented in Nobel Prizes and genius lists.
Yeah. One of the other things I've noticed as a historian when I look at some of these figures, and I'm not specifically the ones in your book, but ones that I've studied, is, and I'd be curious whether you noticed this at all as a theme in any of the figures that you studied, is that often some of the women who are most accomplished were in families that only had daughters, so that there wasn't an option for a family to kind of lavish their resources on a son. And in some cases, a father, I'm thinking, for example, of Henrietta Zold, you know, she was one of 8 girls in the family and there were no sons. And so her father, who was a rabbi and she was the oldest, kind of treated her like he would treat a son because he didn't have a son. If he'd had a son, maybe he wouldn't have lavished as much attention on her or put as much stock in her education. But because there were no boys, then he just raised his daughters as he would have his sons. And I've always kind of wanted to study that. I haven't actually gotten around to doing it, but that I would be curious whether you encountered any of those dynamics.
I didn't look at that specifically either. I do think it's interesting, but I think it is very important. And certainly some generations ago, women needed somebody who believed in them. And they need it now too, but in a very dramatic way. If you were a woman painter in the Renaissance, and I talk about a lot of them in the book, who were quite extraordinary, but they weren't allowed to go to any of the art schools. They weren't allowed into any of the art institutes. The only way they could paint was if their father or brother was a painter and let them into their studio. So yes, women did need that kind of sponsor or mentor, usually as a family member who would be able to do that for them. Whether dads did that more because they didn't have sons, I don't know. I think it's a really intriguing question. But I think it also continues right up to this moment that just about all of the genius women I interviewed said that they had one person in their life who believed in them, and not believed in that kind of generic, oh, sweetheart, you can do anything kind of way, or, you go, girl, but really was very specific about, you're talented in this. You're a great mathematician. Go ahead and do it. Of course, you're smart enough to get your PhD in physics. Go ahead and do it. And sometimes it's a teacher, sometimes it's a friend, sometimes it's a mentor, often it's a parent. And I think one of the great things all of us can now do is to try to give that to somebody that we know, whether it's a child of ours or a friend's child or somebody that we teach or mentor, but to be that person who says, the world may be against you. And when you're a woman, the whole world is never going to be on your side, but I believe in you, and go ahead and do it. And that makes a huge difference.
Well, that was a good segue. Also, I'm glad you mentioned the artists, because we had a question from Leslie about famous artists in your book, because she's, bemoaning the fact that so many of the definitive art history textbooks still really exclude women.
It's stunning. Art would be one of those things where you would think women should be recognized. We all like women to be artists. And it's similar with when we were talking before about Fanny Mendelssohn. In those days, women were expected to play the piano, but they weren't allowed to be great pianists. And we do the same thing with art right now. I saw a number quite recently. I think there's a new exhibit of Artemisia Gentileschi, who is a Renaissance painter, and I talk about her in the book. And there's also an exhibit of her right now, I believe, at the National Gallery in London. And I believe that there are 8 women artists represented in the National Gallery in London, and that in the last 5 years or so, in the major art museums making acquisitions of new paintings, I think it was 10% were from women. These numbers are shocking. This is right now. This is not in the 1600s. And I think what we learn is that who is great in art is really who we call great in art. I tell the story in the book about Clara Peters, who painted in the Dutch Golden Age. She was a compatriot of Rembrandt. And most people had never heard of Clara Peters until just a few years ago, when the Prado Museum in Madrid decided to do a solo show of Clara Peters' work. It was actually the first solo show of a woman that the Prado had ever done. I believe, and someone can correct me if I'm wrong, I believe she's the only woman who had been in the Prado, only woman artist in the Prado up to that point. And so here it was 400 years later, and Clara Peters is suddenly being discovered. And I thought that was wonderful and exciting, to discover these women as you do, Judith, in your work, the women who have been forgotten. But it also makes you a little sad, because you say, if Clara Peters is great now, and we're declaring her a genius now, hasn't she also been great for the last 400 years? And why did we not know that then? And it makes you very much realize, as you started out talking about what the definition of genius is, it makes you very much realize that the definition of genius is, sadly, what the people in power declare is genius. And perhaps as more and more women get in those positions where they can make the declarations, we'll see some of that change too.
Right. And not only, wouldn't it have been nice for people to have been able to appreciate Clara Peters for the last 400 years, but how many other Clara Peters are out there who we have no idea, because their work didn't survive, and they're totally lost to history. And it's probably hundreds or more. I don't know. I don't know how we even do the math to figure that out.
And even beyond that, Charles Jones, the Cambridge professor who I mentioned earlier, he made a very good point to me also, where he said, you know, you can't just dip back into history and try to rediscover the forgotten people and say, if we find them, you know, then we'll equalize the men and women, because the women didn't have a chance. And so, yes, there were, you know, probably hundreds of great women artists whose work was lost, but were there thousands and hundreds of thousands? Maybe not, because maybe that talent was squelched so early that they never even got a chance to pick up the paintbrush. And we have to, you know, there's a balance to that also.
Well, that also brings up another piece that I was thinking about and that I think about a lot in our work at JWA. In one chapter, you talk about historian Laurel Thatcher Ulrich, who is an amazing historian and who coined the phrase well-behaved women seldom make history, actually in an article about Puritan funerals. It's not about women. It's not meant to, she's not using that phrase to actually talk about women who are badly behaved, but rather about the fact that for women who are not badly behaved, we know nothing about their contributions. You know, so, and I think about this a lot in our work, because obviously part of what we're doing is trying to call attention to women like the women in your book who, you know, sometimes were known and have just been not well enough known, and sometimes, you know, weren't really known at all, but have been, you know, sort of basically had some kind of public role. But of course, most people are not those people, right? Most people are, you know, kind of ordinary people. And that doesn't mean that they're not doing amazing things all the time, building families, building communities, building institutions. But they're sort of more in a more kind of everyday way behind the scenes. And we talk all the time at JWA about, you know, the fact that history is unfolding every day, and it's not just made by the people who are in the news. It's made in all kinds of ways by people who are not out in front and in the public. So, you know, when I think about that Laurel Thatcher Ulrich piece, and you talk in the book very, you know, very with great humor about how it's been kind of misunderstood to be this kind of call to action for bad behavior. But really what it's about is that there are so many women who are doing so many things that don't ever rise to attention. It gets back to that recognition piece because they're quiet about it, and they're just kind of head down working, you know, they're the worker bees more maybe. And so I think in our work about, you know, what's the tension between wanting to raise up the people who deserve that prominence because they've been front and center, and what do we do about making sure that all the other kind of ordinary people also get their due in some way? I mean, I recognize that wasn't the topic of your book. Your topic was about the extraordinary, but did you think at all about that piece of, you know, how do we understand genius and ordinary people?
Well, as you said, I wasn't specifically looking at that, but I think the question is, you know, it's hard to say ordinary people, but are people being given the opportunity to do what they want to do? And if there are people who want to live those quiet lives or be parents or, you know, do whatever they may do that's not going to get them recognition beyond a small but important circle, that's great. But how many of those people are making that choice because they don't see another choice? And how many has it been instilled in them from a very early age, whether we recognize it or not, that that's what they should do? I tell the story in the book about Sarah Jane Leslie, who's a professor at Princeton, actually the dean of the graduate school, and also a psychologist, philosopher. And she did a study where she invited very young children into her lab. And she asked them, and she told them a story about somebody who was very, very smart. And then she showed them a picture, 4 pictures, 2 of men and 2 of women. And she asked them, who do you think is the very, very smart person in my story? And up until the age of 5, the children picked the person who looked most like them. The boys picked one of the men and the girls picked one of the women. And at age 6, it changed. And the boys picked one of the men and the girls picked one of the men. And she said she wasn't completely sure what changed at age 6, except that children were starting to get that very clear message. They were seeing it all around them. They were hearing that the smart people are the boys. They were seeing that the powerful people are the men. And all the girl power t-shirts that their parents were putting on them weren't really enough to combat that. So I tell that story as sort of coming around a little bit back to what you were asking, in order to say, when you think you're making the decision of who you want to be and what you want to pursue and how well behaved or not you want to be, how recognized or not in the world, you have to be aware of how much the social messages of your time and of your place that have been instilled in you from the day of your birth are really having an effect on that. And then maybe we can say whether it's who we should be recognizing.
Right. We all are existing within a context that is making a lot of, shaping a lot of things that we're not even aware of. And I think that that's also one of the ways that having women in positions of power changes things, not only because of the representation issue, but also because women see different things because we are trained to see different things. So I'll give another example actually from my mom, who in a book that she published in the 70s, thanked her babysitter for making it possible for her to write her book, because she couldn't have done that without childcare. And I guess at the time that was not done. Now it's like everybody thanks their childcare provider, but at least in the books that I read. But but that was actually, people thought it was sort of shocking, and people were like, "Did you hear that she thanked her babysitter?" But it makes sense that, like, it's not that men didn't need childcare also to write their books, but it just wasn't on their, it wasn't part of their radar of sort of how they thought about what went into accomplishing what they accomplished. They didn't count that labor as part of the package. And women might see it differently. And so when women become, writers and professors, they might then recognize all the, other pieces of the puzzle that make it possible and be able to lift that up in different ways. And so I think that that's also one of the, that's a very minor example, but one of the kinds of small shifts that happen when we have people in power who weren't traditionally the people in power. They can help us see differently how work actually gets done.
Well, and I will admit now to being very envious of you for having grown up with such an amazing mom. And the lesson you had instilled in you from a very early age was obviously that this is normal. Or maybe you knew that your mom was special and wonderful, but this was what people did, and it was okay, and it was perfectly possible to do that. And how great is that? I mean, what a wonderful model and role model for you to have had growing up, and that I'm sure you're doing the same thing for your daughters and children now too.
Yes, trying. They I'm sure they'll tell whatever story it is that they want to tell about it.
Right. It'll get better as they get older. I can promise you that.
Yes, exactly. Right now, yes, I'm sure they'd prefer that there not be any childcare involved, just me. Although now they're 14, so maybe they don't want me around that much either. But that brings me to one of my other questions, which is, thinking about your book goes back into history and looks at so many figures, kind of brings them back to us, and then also looks at contemporary figures and how things are changing. And and I think it's very clear from the story that you're telling a story of an unfinished revolution, right? That we're in the midst of this unfinished revolution of feminism. And I was curious whether you felt, having finished this book, a sense of like, what's the next phase? Where is the next piece of work that needs to be done to make sure that women are able to have the kind of power that they should have, be recognized for their talents and skills? Where do we need to go?
I think the clearest problem that we have is the structural problem in our society, which is that we are the only major country, the only major Western world power that does not give women any support whatsoever in the early childbearing years, and does not do anything about supporting families. And so people often talk about how much has changed, and certainly a lot has changed since I was working and having small children. But when I look at young women now who are working and having small children, I realize, no, that has not changed. As I said before, they're still trying to figure it out themselves. There's nobody there helping them. And I think until we as a society say, this matters, this is important, we've got to put some structures in place to make a difference, then it continues to be in every generation, every woman, every couple figuring it out for themselves, and some of them able to fight through it and some of them not. And I think we lose a lot of extraordinary women and a lot of extraordinarily talented women because of that. So that to me would probably be the next great thing that we would need to work on.
Right. I mean, and COVID has made that so stark. If it wasn't obvious before, then certainly these months of the pandemic and seeing the impact that it's had on working women and families has really made that clear, just the uneven impact that it's had. There's a question that I see from Anat about whether you interviewed any women architects, because she feels that that's a place where it's still very much a man's profession. So were there any architects that you could add to the story?
I didn't interview some and any or include any in the book, though there are several extraordinary women architects. There are so many fields that are very much male fields where some women have done wonderful work. And I think one of the things that made me happiest in this book is, as it was getting towards the end and some people knew about it, all of the emails that I was getting and that I continue to get now of people saying, you know who should have been in the book? You know who you should know? You know who's really wonderful? And I say towards the end of the book, this is not meant to be a compilation. This is really meant to be, the women I interviewed were examples of issues and the issues that I talk about in the book. That it's not a book of profiles by any means. And if it inspired people to say, wait a minute, my neighbor's a genius. Wait a minute, this architect I know is a genius, then I think it's done its job. And hopefully there will be many more that we can write, and that others can write with other women too.
Yes, well, the chat stream tonight is a place to start. There have been a lot of wonderful suggestions in the chat. So, if you wanted if anybody wants to take this on as a project to follow up, then there's a lot there. And you can certainly, for those of you who are looking for other women in your own fields or Jewish women, you can find them on our site. Can you tell us what you're working on now? If it's not a follow-up to this book with all the women who you've learned about since, what can we look forward to from you next?
Well, right now I'm doing the podcast on the Gratitude Diaries, and I've actually been spending the last few months just talking about the genius of women and doing the Gratitude Diaries. So it's been a nice thing to be thinking about in this lockdown time of finding ways to be grateful for 5 minutes every day for my podcast and thinking about the great women past and present. And there will be another project to come, but it's too early to talk about it.
Great. Well, we will look forward. We will look forward to that. Thank you so much, Janice, for being with us and for lifting up these stories of genius women and encouraging us all to look for more. And I have to say, on this last night of Hanukkah, I'm really thinking about how part of the celebration of Hanukkah is supposed to be about publicizing the miracle, right? That's why we're supposed to put our menorah in the window. And in some ways, I was thinking tonight about how I think this in some way relates to celebrating the genius of women, that we're amplifying their stories, we're sharing the light, and it's something that we want to kind of, put in the window and make sure everybody sees, not something to, hide away and keep for ourselves. Speaking of light, this is the last quarantine book talk of 2020. Though don't worry, we will be back in 2021. I want to give a special thank you to all of you who have been with us. We have done, I counted today, 34 online programs between quarantine book talks and the history courses and some other special programs we did since the first one, which was on March 19th. And being with all of you, being in conversation with amazing authors and scholars has been really a true highlight and a saving grace of these very challenging months for me. So I want to thank all of you for being part of this amazing global community. For bringing so much warmth and wisdom over these past 9 months. We will be back in January with more programs, so stay tuned. But in the meantime, I want to wish everybody a happy Hanukkah. I wish you a safe and healthy journey into 2021. May it be a better year. And I hope to see you all in January. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you, Janice.